Chapter 72. The ocean was gone. Ray opened her eyes to a banked lawn leading up to a towering brick wall that stretched out in either direction. The lawn levelled out behind her, spanning a stretch of open ground bordered on the other side by the sentinel trunks of a dark pine forest. He was gone too. Presumably, the man with the cloven thumb was back inside the board's secure zone, working hard, busy accessing their group mind and, perhaps at this very moment, brainwashing them, forcing them all to fall in line with Jolanta and Pascal and doing his utmost to save Ray's neck, which was also his neck. Ray took a few steps and patted the warm brick of the fortress-like wall. So, was this the barrier? The point where she, the Panmotech, was permitted no further? It didn't make sense. Hadn't Mr. Thumb said she wasn't actually in the simulation? Further along, a section of the red brick rampart jutted out. A gateway, perhaps. From where, Ray assumed, Mr. Thumb would exit once he'd done his thing. She strolled over, somewhat bemused to discover that she was now wearing a long white dress. Tripping on the hem of her new outfit, she gathered some material up in her arms and approached the gateway, getting more perplexed the nearer she got. The gate was open. The block stood out from the wall like a castle's barbican, and a dusty track led right through the entrance into the enclosure beyond. There ought to have been some sort of portcullis, drawn down to keep unwelcome visitors out. Not only was the portcullis not down, there didn't even appear to be one. An arch stood over the open entryway. Squinting up, Ray read the Latin inscription chiselled into the stone. Protege me, protegam te, largire mihi ius meum, ut te adiuvem. At her request, her eyeline translated the phrase. Protect me, and I will protect you. Give me my due, that I may help you. Hovering about, unsure what to do, Ray made as if to enter a few times, but kept changing her mind and turning back. Would she interfere with his alterations? Might she unwittingly trigger the security systems and ruin his work? Ray didn't understand. She didn't know what to do. And hadn't that been Mr. Thumb's concern, that she'd be unable to cope with things she didn't understand? Trust the process, she told herself, and try to settle your thoughts. A walled place, an open gate. Protect me, and I will protect you. This was an invitation, not a warning. For all she knew, he needed her. The defences were down, the path clear. Wherever this was, she'd better get involved. Ray picked up the hem of her dress and marched through the gateless gatehouse and over the threshold. There were no more fortifications, no medieval castle, but Ray was pleasantly surprised with the garden she found. Row upon row of short, elderly trees hung low with abundant fruit, generous red globes, larger than any apple. She pulled at one hanging nearby. Pomegranates. It was ripe, and she was tempted to pluck it. But not knowing exactly where she was, Ray had the feeling she'd regret getting unnecessarily involved and let it spring back on its branch. On through the luscious avenues of pomegranate trees, she continued, crouching occasionally to inspect the wildflowers, spotting the overgrown grass. The air buzzed with insects. The flap and clap of pigeons and doves animated the treetops. It was all rather charming. An interesting phenomenon soon caught Ray's attention. Just the sort of detail a panmatech ought to follow up on. Delicate clumps of butterflies clustering together up in the trees. Nearly every tree had a teeming knot of vividly coloured wings collected on their branches, winking and batting in satisfaction. Bald murals whose surface shifted with blues and oranges, lilacs and yellows. The next tree sported its kaleidoscope of butterflies a little lower down the trunk within Ray's reach. She approached it and wafted a hand in their vicinity. A winged cloud took to the air. Only a few remained in situ. Which sort of made it all worse. Ah, I see, thought Ray, her skin crawling. The carcass hanging from the tree trunk was difficult to identify, its decomposition well underway. It was mammalian, could have been a cat, could have been a small monkey, could have been a koala bear for all Ray knew. There was definitely some fur in there. 4 or 5 butterflies focused their efforts on the head area, their wings slowly opening and closing as they buried their proboscises into whatever wetness they found. Ray backed away, and the rest of the swarm landed again to recommence their meal. Moving along, she saw that just about every tree had a rabble of butterflies feeding on, she presumed, yet more carrion. The garden had lost some of its quaintness. Quite a lot, actually. With a shudder, she picked up her pace. One particularly macabre display had her running. A horse. Fucking massive. Pretty much the same size as the tree its body had somehow been suspended from. Although bound in thousands of butterflies, large parts of its body remained uncovered. Some of the legs, its ears, patches on its back. The human corpses she found a little further on were, by this point, quite predictable, and Ray wasn't particularly shocked. She studied the first body for a short while, hanging cruciform from a thick branch, completely covered in small white butterflies with orange wingtips. It was, she thought, quite artistic. In its own way. She considered wafting the swarm off to see who was beneath, but her stomach told her not to disturb the decorated figure, and she heeded its advice. The next 5 trees also had a recognisably human body hung, tied or precariously balanced in their branches. The bauble-like pomegranates the trees bore looked ripe and ready to pluck, but Ray no longer had any desire to try one. "You should have seen it when we had the giraffes," said the lion, padding through the thick grass. "Not an easy operation, I can tell you." The lion was a hefty fellow, a great roll of muscle and mane strolling towards her, each paw as big as her head. Its head was enormous, its jaws gigantic. He seemed pretty chilled. "Can you imagine? We had to get 9 of them up there. 9. After a while, we found it was best to balance them between a couple of trees. Still, we destroyed a good part of the orchard." Another archetype, regal and powerful, the top of the food chain. "Why 9? Ray asked him. "Tradition. It's always been 9. 9 of everything. Birds, beasts of the land and sea, men and..." The apex predator blinked. "Women." They looked at each other for a moment, neither of them in a hurry to speak. Eventually, The lion snorted and broke the silence.
I suppose you've come for the main sacrifice.
It sounded sleepy, like it wanted a nap.
I suppose I have, yes,
Ray replied, wondering what she was getting into. The lion turned and loped off, mouth hanging open, plodding heavily, as if carrying its own weight was a real burden.
This way, then,
it said, over its shoulder.